Okay, here we go. Yet another broadcast. Our little opening logo here for the moment. We'll start up our Peter video. One of these days, we're going to have sound for this. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. And here we are for another exciting thing, at least not too pathetic, discussion of the wonderful world of evolution and science and all that other stuff. Hi, I'm James Downard. I've been working on the Troubles in Paradise project on the methodology of creationism for quite some time. It's kind of cold here in Spokane, rationing the fuel, so I got my coat on. Anyway, Paul Ogia, who, if you're not following him and his wonderful videos, do it. I put a link up to a recent one he just did on genetic entropy, which is a little phrase that's been bandied about in the creationism and intelligent design circles for a while. And it stems from this guy, John Sanford, who is an actual geneticist and a creationist, who is insisting that there are no positive mutations, beneficial ones at all, and that therefore there would be this terrible, hideous, awful load of disgusting mutations if the Earth were really old, and therefore our human species would have died out by now, and other animals probably would have done the same thing, and therefore this proves young Earth creationism, amongst other things. Tiny little problem is Paul demonstrates rather beautifully in his show, where he looks at the primary source arguments of Sanford and also the people who he co-authored with, this Carter fellow, who appeared on a creationist show, and you can see all of that in Paul's video, where Paul was doing absolutely splendid source methods analysis, which is to look up what the sources are and find out what the information actually is and check out to see whether or not the facts match what the creationist says they are, which in this case was nope, they don't. That in fact there are beneficial mutations. And he kind of sidesteps them and pretends that they're not there and mangles the source material to do that. I had heard about Sanford's work for quite some time, but I'd never had a chance to see the book before because I couldn't afford it. And thankfully, Paul actually had access to the cute little thing, and he had it scanned from his own personal copy. It had all those little pencil annotations and all that in it, and sent it to me after I grew aware of the information that Paul was doing for his video. And thank you very much, Paul. And now I could actually see this book that had been circulating around as this Mount Olympus of devastating criticism of the evolutionary dogmas. And I'm going, holy moly, this thing is thin. It's a very lightly argued, poorly documented, sloppily done work that Paul is just skating on the surface of in his discussion of this particular thing about the mutation rates. What really blew me away is when I was able to look at it and see his tiny little source base in a work that was really attempting to be comprehensive and analytical and really establishing that genetic mutations were never beneficial. It would mean you'd really have to survey the literature, which he doesn't do. And his whole bibliography turned out to be a paltry little 5 pages at the end of the book. And that's big spaces to boot. That absolutely floored me. For Evolution Slam Dunk, my book on the reptile-mammal transition, which I shamelessly plug in the notes to the text for this video, I had 100 pages of references, small print, tiny. People have to get out the magnifying glasses sometimes to take a look at them. 2,300 sources. And that was just on a specialized subject of the reptile-mammal transition. I don't think for anything at all that I would be considering it absolutely comprehensive for paleontology general or all the sweep of the genetic subject matter that I bring up. And yet here was Sanford coming up with this amazing argument where it was flying in the face of the primary source material, and it literally doesn't even occur to him to go plowing through any of the technical literature on beneficial mutations. Paul deliciously cited about half a dozen material of actual examples of positive mutations coming up from point mutations and other sources that were proving beneficial for cholesterol and a whole bunch of things, including the nylon-eating bacteria, which I was aware of, and a lot of these others I wasn't. So I naturally, thank you, Paul. I added those into my hashtag data set and followed up on a little bit more research on all that stuff. So I'm constantly fact-checking, which reminds us of the whole notion of what it means to fact-check. That if I see a video like Paul's, I'm not taking his word for it. Nope. I'm looking things up. So I look up the source material to make sure that they're saying what he says it does, and they do, because he's very careful. And that also confirms the fact that the anti-evolutionists, Sanford, and the people relying on him are not playing fair with the facts. So what's interesting is that Sanford has had an impact way outside of young Earth creationism, and indeed the intelligent design movement just goes amok over Sanford as well, even up to the present day. At his video, I called attention to this one journal that Carter and Sanford had published their one and only technical paper together on. Sanford has been published in other contexts, but Carter and Sanford had only done the one paper. And it was in this obscure little technical journal that was dedicated to kind of cutting edge, air quotes, odd, non-mainstream stuff that is rather questionable. And what's interesting, I went through my bibliography just to see what all did I have from that technical journal. I have some 1,700 technical journals in my hashtag tip data set. That involves some 23,000 technical citations at the moment. And so you can see what is important and what isn't, what's relevant and what isn't, just by whether or not it pops up on my scope. And literally, not a single paper had appeared in that journal on its own merit that was in my bibliography. I had only 6 papers in there, the one that Carter and Sanford had written, a couple more that Sanford had co-written, so it's another young Earth creationist argument. Baumgartner was one of the co-authors on one of them, and a couple that were done by intelligent designers that had been pushing their material, not explicitly intelligent design, but then relied on as supposedly supporting intelligent design. And then one final one that was a minor little thing about some genetic mathematical modeling, the only reason why it was in there at all is because some intelligent designers had cited it as supposedly helping their argument some. And so it was a pretty incestuous lot of material that doesn't seem to have any relevance outside of the tiny little niche of anti-evolutionism. And so Sanford is a case of something that happens more and more frequently lately, in that the intelligent design movement, which explicitly doesn't paint itself as a side branch of young Earth creationism, nonetheless functions as a side branch of young Earth creationism by who they cite. And so relying on Sanford as an authority figure on his genetic entropy argument, as though it had some weight, that it had some serious documentary power to it, and not alerting them to the fact that he's got a big axe to grind. He, being a young Earth creationist, thinks the Earth is 6,000 years old. He wouldn't be printed and lauded in Answers in Genesis or ICR if he weren't, because they're really fussy about that sort of thing. And so all the various intelligent design-friendly venues in which Sanford gets alluded to, as if he didn't have a big axe to grind, and if his method might not be immediately suspect because of his ability to believe things that aren't really not true. That should have put a warning flag right up. Oh, I see we've got a joiner in the view. Hello. Who is Salamat? Salamat has a question. Ask away. And we'll see what happens from our viewers out there. Don't have a huge number currently viewing. It's possible they're... Rise asks, do you dream in first, second, or third person? Oh, that's a completely weird and off-the-wall thing. I'm a point of view person myself. First person on that one. That is a very unusual thing to put up as a question on here, having nothing whatsoever to do with any of the topics that we've done, but I will answer it anyway. Dreaming is an intriguing little subject as to why we dream at all, and what purposes does it serve, what evolutionary purposes does it serve. It seems to be fairly broadly ranged in vertebrates. REM state, which was only really discovered within my lifetime, that we don't just do a dream, we actually go through a roller coaster of multiple dreamings. I think it's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different times we go through that cycling. And if you're woke up during a REM sleep, you'll remember it. But what apparently is the case is that all the experience, hi, Peter showed up here. I'll say hi to you just in a moment. I'll finish my thought here on REM sleep. That the brain goes through its little shtick and it never enters short-term memory. So the only memories that you have of dreams are the ones from the very last dream you do. And we don't yet know entirely why we do what we do in sleep, but it is known that the brain systems that are very, very busy there, they're involved in a memory consolidation. So what we perceive as this strange, surreal movie in the brain that may or may not have Freudian implications, may or may not have psychological troubles, may be just a pipe is just a pipe, a cigar is just a cigar, that is involved in memory consolidation at the very least. Mode program updating is how James Burke referred to it in a thing he did on Reasons for Sleep years ago in a special he did on BBC. So that's kind of a little sidebar there about the wonderful world of sleep. And we'll probably have to do a show on that sometime, because it's still very much an ongoing subject as to figuring out why all that's going on and what sort of theta cycles and all the different brain systems that are kicking in on all that stuff. And to what extent people who don't dream or don't sleep seemingly, Edison, for example, was somebody only catnapped, whether or not their brain is doing the same thing, but they don't actually require the full sleep cycles. And that's still ongoing subject. Oh, okay. Hi, Peter. Hello, saying hello, and how you doing?
At the moment, I'm doing great. You mentioned sleep cycles. Mine will be off tonight because Seth Andrews just had me on his stream, and he's agreed to come on our channel. So,
and tell us about who that person is.
You don't know who Seth Andrews is? Really?
I may be aware of him but not by the name. It doesn't ring a bell for me.
The thinking atheist?
Oh, okay. Yeah, as I said, I don't follow everyone in the universe, so it's a lot of them I'm not at all aware of. So you're going to have some really good chats with him then. Yeah, make sure to put in a little link in. If I'm up, I will be delighted to take a look at that one.
Yeah, he's in my first intro, the one we don't use anymore because it's costing me theists who won't come on if they see Eve being grabbed by the boobs by Adam. So, but that one had my the three people that inspired me most in it, and that was Aaron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, and Seth Andrews. So, yeah, he
well, I'll be fun to listen
top.
to the arguments on it. Salamat continues with his curiosity, or her, I'm not sure whether it's a man or a woman. I'm not familiar with the gender of the name there, so if I guessed the wrong one, my bad. I will use a generic they. Does your brain perceive the imagination in second person and then visualize it into a vision that we can perceive as a visualization? All I can say about my own dreams is I'll be kind of third person observing an event in a dream, and then I will find myself in it and I'm doing stuff. And most of the time I'm doing things in the course of dreams. Occasionally I'll get into the more interesting area where you have a lucid dream, and it's usually the last one just before I wake up, presumably, to where I'm realizing something is unusual and I'm acting very volitional. I'm able to really notice incongruities in the scene and all that I'm assuming is my conscious mind starting to kick back in. And that apparently different people dream in completely different ways. Some people have certain kinds of things, like there are people that I know who have said that they have dreams where they wake up and they feel that there's a presence in the room. I've never experienced that. So my cognitive architecture presumably is very, very different. And so it's literally there is no one size to fit all on the brain thing, so that our sleep structures and what our brains are paying attention to or not are probably completely individual and idiosyncratic, even though the common wiring is pretty much the same. But how the brain does what it does in terms of what it pays attention to is totally you. And you may have similarities just demographically with other people, but it's very, very case sensitive, our particular brain doing its own shtick. So how would Seth, how would his views be similar or different on the landscape of atheism? Is ontological atheism, how does he fall on stuff of that frame?
Seth was fundamentalist Christian broadcaster for a very long time before he became an atheist. And I'm not quite sure. I think he was Methodist, but I'm not exactly sure about the denomination. But
what, American or
American? Yes.
Okay. And approximate age?
He's about to turn 50.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So then born in the 60s. It's a little bit younger than me, but that would be he'd be kind of in the same frame as the the Jesus freak thing and the big kind of fundamentalist revival that was just starting to kick in at that time. So that Methodists are normally kind of a more moderate denomination here in the United States, but there are branches of Methodism that are full-blown creationists, and so it depends on the which particular section. The same thing with Lutherans and a lot of others, and Presbyterians that have a more liberal side, but they've also got branches. Now, if you're Baptist, Southern Baptists are right off the bat conservative. They split off at the time of the Civil War over slavery, and they've stayed very, very conservative ever since. And then, of course, Pentecostals, and you've got a thicket. I don't follow it all that much because I'm not a believer, and so I'm not concerned about all the little pecking orders. So then, did he have a particular kind of epiphany moment, or kind of a slow boil, or what?
For him, it went slowly, but at some point he questioned things, and when you got one answer, you get more questions, as we all know. So that's what happened for him. But now he is, I think, one of the biggest names in atheism in the U.S. He has his own podcast, The Thinking Atheist. He has a forum. He has a website. He does talks all over the U.S. He was with Aaron Ra and Matt Dillahunty in the Unholy Trinity, and so they traveled the world together to do talks. I think you could say he's just one of the three biggest names in atheism at the moment when it comes to being an activist, to being active and active in a lot of different ways. He also produces videos for other atheists when they do talks, stuff like that. So
now I literally don't keep a tally on the kinds of things. The other two, Aaron Ra and then the other one, I don't know their backgrounds enough to know, were they ever religious?
Aaron Ra was raised in a Mormon family.
So he's kind of close. My family comes from Mormons, although I was never raised in it.
Yeah, Aaron Ra fell off quite early at a quite young age. Matt Dillahunty actually was he was a Baptist, and he was studying to become a Baptist minister.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
When he became an atheist.
It wouldn't be atypical, because if you just think about it, most of the people on the planet believe in a religion. So the odds are that the average atheist has been raised in a religious household or been in it in some context. So of any individual person, especially an activist, having come from a secular background, unless they kind of get the bee under the bonnet, I think there would be logically a more of an impetus for somebody who is an apostasy type to take a proactive interest in it, as opposed to somebody who was just raised where religion never was a factor. And I kind of only got slid into it because of the creation evolutionism issue.
Yeah, well, what I do know is that at least Matt Dillahunty and Seth Andrews have had a lot of problems with with their families. Seth Andrews has almost no contact with his parents, which he mentioned a couple of times in his talks, which is still bugging him greatly. But
yeah, as I would imagine so. We get a lot of that in local secular and atheist groups here that I know of personally here, regionally. That the big bunch of them are people who have been raised in very conservative religious families, and it was like the worst thing they could do to ever come out about it, and they've been disowned and shunned and all the rest for it. So that tale is all too common, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that's one of the saddest things that can happen, and that's why I don't understand that the religion of love is one that would shun people if they stop believing. I mean,
and it's interesting there to see the dynamics of ones that don't do that. The ones who actually live the religion of love, independent of whether it's from a Christian context or Islamic or others, that they really take it to heart properly, and therefore can get over the fact that they have a dealing with a non-believer. But we can see that this pops up particularly in stressful contexts. If the religion feels itself kind of under siege, and if it regards itself as the outsider versus insider kind of mentality, Mormonism has that as a historical background. It was a persecuted faith. Methodists don't have that as a recent thing, but my suspicion would be, because of the fact that he was being shunned about it, that it's if he is from a Methodist background, that it must be from one of the more conservative sides of Methodism, because they tended to be rather a little more liberal. Although I have to say that it was a Methodist church that my mom sent me to for Sunday school, because she always wanted all of us kids to be exposed to it. She wasn't a believer herself particularly, and so she didn't care much about it, but she was okay with having us exposed to it. And it was a Methodist church down in California. It's the one that I got kicked out for asking questions about the flood. So it may have been a little bit like that. Well, this is way off topic from the discussion of genetic entropy, but it was a nice little side issue. Has that kind of stuff about genetic arguments popped up much in the creationist apologetics you've run into in your own experience there, Peter?
Actually, I came here to learn, because genetic entropy, so far, I've never heard it mentioned.
It's one that has no role whatsoever for all practical purposes in the regular science thing. There may be a gene load. Then the idea that you've got mutations that can be any one of three things. They can be a positive good for the moment at that particular moment, and there could be a negative mutation, which would be obviously something that's being a problem. And then there's the neutrals. A lot of things are obviously neutral. If you're familiar with how the DNA thing, just imagine a long ladder of the DNA code and segment it off into triplets. So every 3 rungs is a codon, and each one of those codes for an amino acid. That's an easy metaphor to keep track of. Well, often it doesn't matter if there's a mutation in one of the 3 codons. If in certain places, the what are called the synonymous ones, that a change of an amino acid there won't, or a nucleotide, won't necessarily change the amino acid that it's coded for. So there can be mutations there, and it won't have any effect at all, because it'll still make the same protein. Although it could affect some of the structural bits of how it's plugged together, and that could theoretically have some effects, because of we have to remember something else, is how proteins are assembled. They're really fast. I've never even seen a video that tries to show how quickly things are done in the cell. It's like the speed at which replication takes place, the speed at which amino acids are plugged together is a blur of speed. It's, you know, dozens of amino acids a second kinds of things. And it can vary from one organism to another, is what I understand. Now they've only just now begin to appreciate just how amazing a lot of that stuff is and how intricate. But the mutations that would occur there, if they're synonymous ones and actually change the amino acid, that runs the risk that the amino acid will change the protein in some way, because it may change how it folds a particular amino acid in a particular spot. If you put a certain amino acid or a certain mutation in certain critical folds where the protein has to fold in a certain kind of a way to be functional, that can be a big deal. So not all mutations in a particular protein sequence would be equally good or bad. Depends on where. And then is the issue of mutations that are taking place in regulatory sequences. So this is just, we were just talking about the basics of the structural proteins, the actual ones that are used to make things, that make your skin, that make the membranes of stuff, that interact for moving calcium back and forth inside of the brain, all that kind of stuff. There's also the regulatory sequences, cis-regulatory things that are the things that tell the gene to turn on and off. And you can have mutations there. And then you can have even higher level ones that are the homeobox genes and the body plan genes that deploy how the turn off and on genes are deployed. Any one of those can operate at any one of those layers. And whether or not they're good or bad or open up things where you suddenly get a gene mutation that produces a duplicated version of the gene, and suddenly you got two copies of it. And each one of those can now theoretically vary. So one of them may end up still doing what the original gene did, but another one can mutate in a way that causes it to develop new functions. And gradually now we're in the stage that's just been within the last 20 or 30 years where they can retro-engineer stuff. Genomics a lot on the show because it's just an absolutely fascinating example of where you can take two gene codes and you understand by their phylogeny and the various elements inside of them that they're closely related but not identical. You can then go backwards and retro-engineer what the ancestral form needed to be like to be able to produce these two current versions. And then you can physically test out the properties of that ancestral version to find out that it's kind of got a generic thing. It's neither one nor the other, and it's able to eventually mutate, so you can see how the natural process works. And the point that Sander is trying to do, let me pause just for a moment to check what's going on over there. Yes, it's about a side area. Yeah, I'm afraid, Reyes, we'll have to go into all of the material on dreaming and brain stuff and that in another area. I've got a Facebook page. You can hunt around for James Downard. You'll see my mug up there, and you'll go, that's the one, and say hi, and that's fine and dandy. Or my hashtag tip website. You can come in there. Anybody can put questions up right there, and I'm happy to do so. People can put questions in to do on the show, as a matter of fact. And anyway,
James, quick tip.
What we got them with,
James, yeah. Quick tip.
Mm-hmm.
If you go into the About section on your YouTube channel, you can actually add your Facebook and your Twitter, so they will show up on screen so people can click it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to worry about that in future things. I'm still slow as molasses on a lot of this stuff. I do try to put in the main website anyway, and you can find a lot of that stuff on there. It was just only last year that I got doing YouTubes because of SciStrike. So I mean, I'm onward and upward excelsior on this. Anyway, the point about the genetic entropy argument is that what they're attempting to do is make a jujitsu argument. So I like using that term. It's the idea that you can find some trick to dislodge evolution by prying it in some absolutely rigorous mathematical way. So what Sanford thinks he can do is, first of all, to deny that beneficial mutations happen at all, and to do that, jaw drop, that's just claptrap wrong, because I know a ton of things like that, and Pelagia was able to find a whole slew of those examples as well. And the whole essence behind the role of things is that since most of the mutations are neutral, It only takes a few little occasional positives to be able to counteract all of the genetic drift and things that occur to ratchet the biology up. Another factor, of course, is that Sanford doesn't seem to understand. For a geneticist, that seems obviously rather obtuse, is what the hell does it mean to be beneficial? Beneficial is not a fixed thing. It's in the context of stuff. Whether some is in the bacterial immune reactions, for example, where bacteria will develop resistance to immunity. And I went into this in some extent in tip 1.7, a tip. I'll put that up there for all those in the audience there. At my website, where there's a thing on bacterial resistance and Michael Behe's imipenem stuff that he did at the Dover trial. And then in Evolution Slam Dunk, I went into the chloroquine case. It's the case that individual mutations that occur in particular spots can contribute ultimately to the matter. In the chloroquine case, what was so fascinating about it, and Michael Behe, the intelligent design, irreducible complexity guy, for those who aren't aware of who he is, he's a Lehigh University biochemist who has gotten on the anti-evolution bandwagon, and he's one of their big stars in the intelligent design movement. Anyway, he was trying to argue that the chloroquine resistance was somehow involved mutations that were so incredibly rare to occur, and you had to have just zillions of little bacteria doing their little shtick, mutating like mad, to produce even that amount, and that they were so relatively rare that he could use that as a line in the sand to absolutely rule out any mutations or evolution that involve multiple mutations occurring like that in tandem. And so that was The Edge of Evolution. That was the name of his 2007 book. Well, gosh, was he wrong. Because the thing is that in this chloroquine resistance case, what you had was that they found this beautiful drug that would basically choke the little bacteria to death. And they would dump it in there and the bacteria would drop dead. Well, there was a mutation that could occur, and another mutation, one mutation didn't have any much effect at all. It was in the channel that allows stuff to go into the inner part of the cell. And what happens was, if there's a degradation system in the bacterium, that if the material stays outside, the bacterial system will take care of it. But if it can prevent, they have a decay system has to get in. So if it pumps all the material in, it just does fine. But if the material stays outside, it can let its natural cleanup crew take care of it. So it has to restrict the ability of stuff to get pumped into the center of the bacterial cell, and then it can manage to survive this new medicine. Well, that also has downsides, because it's limiting the ability of stuff to get into the cell for nutrients and a lot of other things. So that means that even though the cell can survive this, it's not as efficient at it as it was before, unless other things happen. So it turns out, because the mitochondrial genes that are the energy producers inside of the cell are the smallest of any organism everywhere. It's only like 6,000 nucleotides long. It's ridiculously restricted. It turns out that it can produce all sorts of mutants that can compensate for this problem elsewhere in the cell. So it's never a case of one or two things having to happen all at once. It's stuff that's already happened that didn't have any effect that now becomes beneficial for the cell in the context of this new environment of this medicine that's being dumped at it that it wants to survive. So the notion of that you can define in advance what beneficial and deleterious are is nonsense. It's totally context sensitive. And it's revealing that Behe, who is a biochemist and tried to be discussing this issue, is still way removed from the data field. And then somebody like Sanford is doing it as such an abstraction that it's functionally totally divorced to any reality. Brian, hi Brian. You saw in the Greek room and didn't get a notifier. Yeah, I got in quite late. I was out in the at a meeting thing out with our secular groups over in Idaho, and then I had to come back and stop off at the bank and try to find out if I can renegotiate a bank loan to try to keep myself above water on that front, and that's still in limbo. And so then I got home here late and had to get everything up to speed. I'd already plotted out what I wanted to do on the show, which was discussing Paul Pelagia's wonderful takedown of Sanford. And it's which cycles us back around to the whole methods question. Yeah, Brian says, Behe is removed from the data field on reality, period. Yeah, I kind of like that. Another thing that I find fascinating about Behe is how he doesn't think at all about the wonderful world of the young earth creationists. He just likes to pretend they don't exist, even though they're the majority of anti-evolutionists. And in the case of people making use of genetic entropy, they're right there in their midst because of Sanford. And the fascinating thing about Behe is that he has been on more than one occasion involved in debates where there's been a representative of a theistic evolutionist and a young earth creationist and intelligent designer. They won't necessarily even bother to invite a non-theistic evolutionist on. And he just doesn't think about any of them. He just does his spiel about the bacterial flagellum and all the rest. He doesn't get up there and start criticizing flagellology. So he literally ignores them, even though they've got their own agendas and they're more popular than intelligent design is. All of that becomes pretty obvious if you use the same methods that Pelagia did. I'd love to take credit for him being a methodology guy, but no, he was doing that before I came along. But I will proudly say that he kind of upped his game as a result of studying my work and looking at the material at TIP and looking at the whole notion of primary sources. And he's good at it. He's very diligent. He's witty. And he does wonderful graphics and all that kind of stuff that I admire greatly. And the method is a killer because it really does do two things simultaneously. First, it measures the quality of the person you're analyzing. And in the case of Sanford, you discover, whoa, boy, are they bad. And therefore, Carter must be bad not to notice it. And Eric Hovind and the bunch must be even worse, never to bother to fact check any of them because there's this daisy chain of ignorance. And then the other side is, in the process of reading all of this material, you become familiar with the science directly. So you become more informed. You begin to understand about mutation rates. You begin to understand about what the mutations involve, the genetic material. And gradually you build up your own familiarity with it. I started out in exactly the same boat. I mean, I'm a history guy. I never even took biology in high school. And so much of this material was stuff that I came at only because of the anti-evolution thing that I had to kind of bone up on it. And the more and more that I got involved in the primary source technical literature, which is so accessible nowadays, holy moly, right off the bat with Pelagia, it's an interesting measure because when he would send me the script of what he was going to be doing for vetting, and I would go through it, and I pointed out a few little minor details that he might want to adjust in some other little area. One source, for example, that actually there was a different source that was the one that Sanford had actually specifically referenced and all that little minor minutia. But I was always looking to see whether I could get the full text. If it wasn't in my bibliography, I'm going to put it in there because it's relevant to Sanford. And almost all of the papers involved in Pelagia's investigation were directly available full text, one place or another, either directly on the journal or available through a ResearchGate or one of these other professor sites and that, which means everybody can do what Paul does and what I do and what Jackson Wheat does and all of these others. And that is do direct source analysis. The only thing preventing it is bloody laziness, because we know the information is so accessible now that costs no money. I mean, I'm got zip money to be able to do stuff. If I had to pay $5.99 for a read of an article at Nature magazine, I'd be screwed because I don't have the funds to do that kind of stuff. Or for that matter, Sanford, I couldn't afford to get his book, but thanks to Pelagia, thank you, Paul. He sent me the material on that. And so now I could observe the data directly. And the more information that you see directly, the more powerful it becomes. Brian had to laugh about Hovind and fact check in the same sentence. Yeah, I don't have any indication that Eric Hovind has ever bothered to source fact check anything in his bloody life. That what he does is listen to people, and you can see him on the shows that he does. including the excerpts that Paul has got up on his stuff, where he's just nodding, oh yeah, and he's accepting everything that he is being told as gospel, kind of like how he accepts the gospel as gospel.
I'm not
Jump in, Paul.
sure, I'm not so sure if that's the fact. I mean, I've watched a lot of these guys, and I'm pretty much convinced that Eric knows he's lying. He knows better than what he's telling people.
No, I'll disagree completely. I think exactly the opposite. When I'm watching him do that thing, that this kind of cheery, bleary-eyed acceptance, that you can see how easily it is, and he got it from his dad. Dad's same way. Kent is a secondary redactor, just like Eric. Eric listens to people who tell him what he wants to be true. Kent Hovind effectively was reading people he wanted to be true. So Kent Hovind sucked up all of the material from 1960s and 70s creationism, and Eric is doing the same with current creationism.
Yes, but I still think there's a difference. I think that Hovind Senior might actually be too stupid to look into it, because first of all, I know for a fact that he can't write properly, so reading would be another problem.
He can't, yes, but remember, intellect is not.
But Eric, I have to say, Eric is a lot more intelligent than his father is.
But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Philip Johnson.
People like Aaron Ra took him on and explained to him simple facts. And even though he has then the ability to check if what Aaron says is correct, and Aaron called him a liar to his face. And if you see the response, then to me it's clear he knows, and he's just in it for the money. And
I'd love to see the example as well, because here the benchmark that I use is Philip Johnson. Before I jump in on that, I'm just saying Brian says that he spends, Brian Stevens in the live chat, he spends more time fact-checking news than I do reading the article itself. That is completely plausible. That is very much the case, that it always takes me more time to ferret out, especially if I want to ground it in as much information as possible, than it was for the person to put up the original material in the first place, because there's always much more of a story involved. It's always a pyramid of data where you got the blip up at the top, but there's actually a mountain of stuff below that you need to do for context. But the benchmarks for me are Philip Johnson and Richard Milton. Both of them are anti-evolutionists in interesting ways, and both of them are bright people. Philip Johnson got into Harvard when he was 16 years old. The guy is not stupid. He's an accomplished lawyer. He has a regular degree, got the anti-evolution bug after he had a messy divorce, and apparently he got religion, and there's all sorts of motivations to it. But nobody can accuse Johnson of being intrinsically stupid or incapable of reading things or writing declarative sentences and getting things accurate. So that rules out the Hovind problem. And yet, when you look at how he approaches data field, he will lack curiosity, never follow through, not look up the material to find out backgrounds. There's just this deadening nothing going on. And even when you would present them with contrary information, and I've done that with him, with Johnson, email and directly in person and all the rest, it just hits a brick wall, and he never pays attention to material on that. Now, he's way above the pay grade of Eric Hovind, and I don't see any reason that Eric wouldn't be doing the same thing. If you call him a liar, all he's going to do is look at you like, well, there you go, and I'm the poor persecuted Christian that's just been called a liar, when he is convinced that what he's just said is true. And because he's a Tartucan, he'll never occur to him to fact check any of it. He'll just go back to the little rock where he has his certainty and never investigate a damn thing. And I've seen exactly that same phenomenon with Philip Johnson, who's way above it. Now, Richard Milton is an even more interesting case, because not only is he, at least he used to be the head of British Mensa magazine, so obviously he can do those little rotation puzzles, and he's got a high IQ. At the same time, functionally, he's a young Earth creationist, because his whole thing, he's rejecting the geologic system and all the rest. And if you look And he's also not religious. That's the thing where my jaw dropped. I go, how can you be a young earth creationist without being a creationist? I didn't think it was possible until I saw Richard Milton. And the moment I started investigating his source method, there were the telltale elements. His over-reliance on secondary sources. He's not thinking through what he thinks happened with stuff. Never connecting up information from elements from other sources, even sources he'd read. So I knew he had information that didn't match up with other information. His brain never puts it together, independent of how bright they are. And so all you need to do for an Eric Hovind level is be an average schmo who has an objective desire that they want to be true, and they accept the things they want to be true without ever investigating them. He's never going to look up Carter or Sanford. He's never bothering to even read their stuff. And if you come up to him like an Aaron Ra would, where you catch him on some material and you call them a bloody liar, they're just going to the shell. Oh, the poor person calls me a liar. Well. And it will literally never occur to them to fact check any of that stuff, because their brain shuts down at that point. It happens with Philip Johnson. It happens with Richard Milton. It happens with Jonathan Wells was another fascinating example. Also, Wells is not stupid. He's, for those of you who don't know, he's the author of Icons of Evolution and Zombie Science, which if I had the money I would get, but I can't afford that either, although I doubt there's anything really seriously new in it, but it's fun to look at from a source methods direction. Anyway, I mentioned this in both the old Dynamania chapter in 3 macroevolutionary episodes at the tip site, and then I reprised it in Evolution Slam Dunk. It had to do about whether he could conceptualize what intermediates look like. And my working model in my evolution analysis is that literally Tortugan minds don't conceptualize certain things. That's how they manage to do what they do. That's how Eric does what he does. And that they just don't think about stuff. In the case of a transitional form, Wells had shot his mouth off repeatedly about Archaeopteryx, and he goes about Deinonychus and the fact that those are 20, 50 million years after Archaeopteryx, and therefore can't be used as evidence for the evolution of birds from dinosaurs and all this kind of stuff. And if you actually investigate the source details, you find out that he's missing data in his own sources, that they're in fact Maniraptor and theropods predate the Archaeopteryx, and all you're seeing with Deinonychus is the most spectacular example. All of that's scholarly data. I was looking at conceptual. So I had to write him, even though we were in the internet email era, he had no email. And so I couldn't contact him anywhere by that route. So I physically wrote a letter to the Discovery Institute, and it forwarded. And I was having doubts that I might ever hear from him. But what I carefully phrased the letter in such a way that he wouldn't know whether I was pro or against evolution. It wouldn't send any cues. So I had to be very careful about how I phrased things so that it could theoretically be from somebody that was a fellow traveler asking a legitimate question. And the question was, okay, let's assume that Archaeopteryx is not a transitional form. What would a pure, perfect transitional form look like in the case of birds? How could I tell them apart? And I was predicting that he had never thought about that and would never think about it, no matter how hard you pushed. And I was just thunderstruck by how perfect his reply was, where he literally wrote back to me, "Oh, I've never thought about that. But Archaeopteryx is a bad example of an intermediate." Excuse me, John, we're trying to move past Archaeopteryx. If you had an Archaeopteryx and a perfect intermediate together on your desk, how could I tell them apart? And in order to do that, you'd have to conceptualize that. Well, there's no part in his brain that conceptualizes that. There can be no transitional forms in principle. Everything A and not A both mean the same thing, which in the logic biz blows your brain apart. And so if it were just Jonathan Wells that was doing this mistake, that would be one thing. But literally, I know of no counterexample in the entire history of anti-evolutionism, from San George Mivart in the 1870s all the way down to Michael Denton, of any anti-evolutionist being able to explain what the hell they would accept as a transitional form. And that's because, not because they're being dissembling or liars, but their brain goes into mode exactly the way Mark Huffman did in that debate with me when I asked him a methods question, where he just was going,
but don't you think there are two different kinds of apologists some that are in it just for the money, and some that are in it and just have to deny it because they desperately want to cling on to the belief they have. So they'll just avoid
Oh,
getting in better info that would prove them wrong.
well,
Because
but that there,
if you look at, and Paul did a couple of videos on him. If you look at Eric Hovind, the way he made money with his movie, I think he got paid for making the movie. I think maybe triple the amount that was needed, because in the end it wasn't a complete movie. It was filled with all kinds of interviews.
oh,
To
I never underestimate the power of money to grease people's enthusiasms. For a moment, think that the majority of people who are anti-evolutionists, including Eric Hovind, are ones that are just in it for the money. They naturally want to make a living at it. They're naturally happy to make a living at it. And if they can make a really good living at it, Ken Ham pulls down 150 grand a year. Steve Meyer pulls down 150 grand a year. Boy, I'd love to pull down 50 grand a year. And I'm nowhere at that level by any means. But that is on top of their convictions, that it's way easier for them to feel validated by the money. They have people coming in and helping them, and they have people financing their material. And then they may, if they have a Tortugan mind, remember, in order to be an anti-evolutionist, you got to have a Tortugan mind. They can compartmentalize things, and so they can be useful to have the perks. There, Kent Hovind managed to do all sorts of little cheaty things, but he doesn't perceive them as cheating. So I'm really very charitable on this kind of a thing. That if I didn't have the examples that I could see, I would be more likely to think it's just in the money. My mom had that attitude about preachers. She thought that all preachers were just sky pilots that were just in it for the money. And I was the one that was saying, no, actually, most of them actually believe that. And
I agree that a lot of people believe it, but the fact that Eric changed his entire religion when his dad went to prison. He started following Saitem Bruggencate. He threw away the Bible that he grew up with and thought was the only real word of God. He threw away everything. He threw away his entire foundation for his belief and became a presuppositionalist the moment he met Saitem Bruggencate. So I don't know.
well,
If he can do that that easy, then he should be able to at least check out some of the things that he's been told to see if there's any validity in it.
those are totally different dynamics. Is that what you have is when you realize what the object of desire is. When somebody finds some new form of apologetics, everybody has senses of conflict resolution. In fact, we know part of the brain system that engages in self-deception, the anterior cingulate cortex, that primates use to resolve social conflict. And what happens is, I think, in the brain, is that the brain is noticing things that are problematic, and it's trying to find ways of avoiding that up in the upper level, because it's basically going, oh, no, you don't want to think about that. No, that's, oh, now you're thinking about this over here. Oh, that's much, much better. And so the brain can find ways to reinforce stuff. And so one of the reasons why you can get hypocritical elements. Now, I don't rule out the craven doing it for the money type. We know that there are actual spiritualists, for example, in the spiritualist movement, who have written memoirs about how they knew what they were saying was complete bullcrap, and they were in it just for the money. And I don't have any doubt that there are probably some creationists that do that. But I don't need to presume a priori that any individual creationist is in that. If you can find in a matter of where they finally come clean about it, then find it dandy goody gumdrops. But the methodology that allows a brain to not think about the stuff they don't want to think about is really deep-seated. And when I see it going on in somebody that no one would for a moment think that Philip Johnson is in that viewpoint just because of any money that he's making out of it or anything else. He's a true believer. And he's brilliant. He's knowledgeable. He's no doubt about it, capable of doing very meticulous scholarly research. And yet, in every possible instance, when he would need to really use that, he fails to do so. Perfectly fine example. I've never seen a single instance of where Philip Johnson has shown his interest in reading actual paleontology works. Not once. He virtually, even when he brings up something, it would be something, and of course, he doesn't even think about it at all anymore. But he pretty much stopped doing it by the mid-1990s. He would allude to a newspaper article or something about some new bird fossils. He did that in one of his books in the mid-1990s, and that was about as far as he went. Didn't occur to him to read any of the technical literature. And yet I know that he reads Answers in Genesis. Why? Because he literally recommended John Woodmarap's paper on the reptile-mammal transition, the one that I dismantled in Slam Dunk. He recommended that to David Berlinski, who then tossed it out as an example of a legitimate analysis that needs to be looked at by people. And so here's somebody that Johnson, who never has any curiosity to read the immediately accessible material, or for that matter, trot on over and talk with the paleontology department at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was a law professor. Would literally never occur to him to do that. I know personally from Padian that Johnson never did that. And so this is a matter of the brain not doing things, not looking at stuff. You find this in apologetic stuff. In the when I had devised this whole mechanism of how the brain works, and looked at, well, if you've got this anti-evolution, don't pay attention to stuff. How does it apply to apologetics and their biblical analysis? And so I was looking at how the same kinds of people, Philip Johnson, how he was approaching matters of the religious crises and all the rest in the church and the Inquisition and other kinds of matters. And he was using exactly the same, not really thinking through about it that he wanted to. He would grasp at straws on stuff. I would predict that if Eric is not a craven lunatic who's just doing it for the money and really doesn't believe a damn thing what it is when he's told that, there would be no reason for him to check out any of the material. But if he's a Tortugan mind, his mind won't let him do that. His mind literally will not think to do that. And when you see that same phenomenon go on with Michael Denton, Michael Denton is a non-believer. He's an agnostic. And when you look at how he approaches the data field in his latest book on evolution, that just came out last year, and then I criticized big chunks of it in Evolution Slam Dunk, I looked through all of his source base, and in every single instance that I investigated for the purpose of the book, the feather case, the mammal case, maple leaf formation, and then insects, ants, he would latch himself onto peripheral source material or occasionally technical literature and then not read very closely down that level. This is a guy with a patina of science. He's been published in Nature magazine on Platonic forms and stuff, you know, maybe about 10 years ago with a co-author. So, I mean, the guy has science creds in many levels, and yet at critical junctures, you could just see his little brain turning off, the curiosity meter dropping off. And in the mammal case, it was particularly spectacular. We're just about at the end of the show, but I think I'll be able to squeak it in because of the thing. I'll give the short form. And this will be a wonderful plug for people to get my book so they can read the long form. Denton tried to dismiss the reptile-mammal transition without discussing any of the examples, while briefly describing all the basic characters as a generic kind of a thing in a single paragraph, without citing a single source for it. And then when he decided to get rid of it, he relied upon a single science source for trying to argue that there was no adaptive element to this little articular quadrate driving this biology change. He was getting the data wrong, so he was misunderstanding the nature of the problem right off the bat, which I noted. But the worst part was, the one and only source he decided to cite not only was irrelevant to the point he was making, but contained within it information that was relevant, that when you followed up on it, about the nature of what was driving the dentary bone expansion, that it was the shape of the jaw for eating insects, and therefore it was completely adaptive, that it blew his entire argument to smithereens, and he never realized it because he never bothered to read any of that stuff in detail. And when you find that happening, when I'm sure when Aaron Ra calls the guy a liar on it, it's just rolling off of the Tortugan brain. And the idea that he would need to fact check any of it literally doesn't happen. The brain shuts down and he just moves on to where he was safe. This happens over and over and over again. And the idea that everybody is doing it just for craven purposes, what about people who aren't making any money at it at all? These are just the average creationist in the street you bump into. And they don't have a pile of money. They don't have a foundation. They're not doing videos. And yet their behavior is absolutely indistinguishable. Mark Huffman, that I debated with, had exactly that same element to it. That nobody is accusing him of making money on things. He's got a job as anesthesiologist.
I agree. On Hoffman, I agree. I have two exemptions when it comes to that, and that's Ray Comfort and Eric Hovind. I think they both know very well that what they're saying isn't true. But I'm completely derailing your topic.
Oh no! But this is a legitimate issue because I get into the same knockdown, drag out. Strike and Steve McRae all agree with you on this. They're convinced that Andrew Snelling is a fraud, that he must know that he's wrong. And I'm sitting back there with my little Tortugan model, going, "No, it's much weirder than that. They actually believe it. That there's no way you can penetrate the mind shell. That's the whole point about a Tortugan mind shell. It's absolutely impervious to evidence."
There's also Todd Wood, who was in Is Genesis History.
Todd Wood is an intriguing case. He is the fascinating measurement here. Because Todd Wood is what Richard Dawkins calls an honest creationist. He's one who acknowledges that the evidence supports evolution. Evolution is not a theory in crisis. And you know something else about him? He is actually very meticulous scholar. He's the one and only person I've ever encountered in the creationism biz who is actually careful primary source material. And it often leads him to weird and oddball conundrums that he gets into. He's the one that figured out that he's willing to put one of the Australopithecines in the human holobaramin. I mean, you're going, what? This is just absolutely preposterous.
Sorry, James. I had to mute myself because I was laughing out loud. Beach has the solution. Look in the chat.
Oh, the tinfoil hats?
No.
brain condoms?
Brain condoms.
In effect, that's exactly what's going on. Because I call it the deer in the headlight look. And you found it with Mark Huffman. When you the thing is, it's not how they're dealing with the content, it's how they're dealing with the question about the content. That when you hit somebody's Tortugan ruts, something that their brain doesn't want to think about, you get a deer in the headlight moment. You get a kind of a, and then when they resume talking, it may be an answer to a question. It just won't be the question you asked. And you can find this in politics. You can find it in a lot of different contexts. And Huffman did what was just a classic deer in the headlight look on this kind of thing. But the intriguing thing about Wood is that he is one that's perched on what may be at some point an epiphany moment. That he accepts that there's no evidence for creationism other than the Word of God. His version of young Earth creationism is totally Bible dependent. And I'll tell you an example that he reminds me of, and it's from a completely oddball area. It's Arthur Edward Waite, the occultist that invented the modern tarot. A strange connection about all kinds of things. Almost every tarot deck you see, if you go into Barnes & Noble or whatever and go over to the tarot deck section, the decks will look umpteen different versions, but they're all functionally copies of the Waite deck. Waite's designed for the Rider-Waite tarot back in 1910, and which has illustrated suit cards. It was a way to speed things up so you didn't have to memorize anything. You could just see a pretty little picture of somebody moving around 6 swords that tells you what it's supposed to mean. It was enormously influential, and particularly in the cult boom in the 1960s, started taking over like the AIDS virus and driving out all these other little tarot versions that had differing tarot sequences in that. That's a side issue of things. Anyway, Waite was simultaneously a careful scholar and a harebrained occultist. That if you read his analyses of things, he carefully looked through, for example, there was a theory that the gypsies had something to do with the tarot. And he knew enough about the things where he investigated, no, the gypsies arrived too late for this. They couldn't have anything to do with the tarot. So he could be very careful and meticulous in certain zones. And yet outside of the zone, he has the object of desire, that there's something really, truly occulty, spiritually about the tarot. And he would just run roughshod over stuff to get to it. So he would redesign the tarot cards, he would move cards into a different position, he'd rearrange what the pictures look like, all as if this weren't rewriting the text. And so there's this odd combination of meticulous scholar and ideologue that has things they want to be true. Within that Tortucan rut, it's impervious to evidence. And this is borne out by the long tradition that the higher up on the food chain you get in the anti-evolution movement, the longer it's retained as an object of desire. When you look at it methodologically, the more intractable that Tortucanosity is, the more intractable their lack of curiosity is. And it has spin-off, because in order to be like a good historian, you got to pay attention to all the data, you got to be fair with the facts, you got to be honest and meticulous. And when you see that misrepresentation of source material, when you see their brain apparently shutting off because they tunnel vision in on a phrase they read. There's the Genesis Mark. He's a little Twitter creationist that I joust with. His name is Genesis something or other, and then he's Mex Mark, I think. And I'm not sure whether he's from Mexico or the moon. It's hard to tell. Who knows on the internet? But he is one of these that will home in on little phrases in a paper. You would throw a technical paper at him, and instead of actually paying attention to the data in it, which is the point of the paper, he would find a phrase where somebody said that they feel that a particular theory might be true. Oh, they're just feelings. Aha, aha. And that allows his brain to dismiss all of the rest of the paper without ever discussing anything about it. And I'm sure it's just the thing where it suddenly goes bloop and off the scope. So that Tortucan frame, I think, accounts for all of that. So I'm charitable. Now, if it turns out that someday Eric has an honest moment and writes a tell-all film, a biography, where he says, oh, it was bullshit all along, I knew my dad was a crook right from the get-go, but boy, I was making a hell of a lot of money off of it, then you will have made your point, and I will be happy to put him into Tim as an example of an honest apostate. But as a working hypothesis, knowing what brilliant minds can do in this area, and not just there, if you look at the history of spiritualism, if you look at the history of psychic phenomenon, if you look at a whole bunch of areas that are very bright and accomplished people that just walk off the gangplank of dumb, especially later in life, although Eric's still quite young, but some people, their brain farts occur very, very early.
Yeah, but see, here's the difference. The people you talk about are on an academic level. Even Huffman is. Eric is not. So
oh, well, that doesn't bother me.
If Eric would leave the creationist scene, he'd never be able to make the money he makes now. Never.
Well, that is a factor that relates. If you look at it's probably the case that several percentage of all preachers everywhere don't actually believe what they preach. We know that from the Clergy Project, that quite a few, they stick it out for years and years and years, and then finally they figure out, first of all, they have no work. Outside of that, they're one of the major ones in the Clergy Project who was talking about his experience was that he has no skills outside of being a preacher. And so if he suddenly leaves, he's suddenly left without a house because he's no longer with the ministry. So that free house is gone. His wife leaves him. The kids are gone, blah, blah, blah. He's disowned. So he's up the shit creek. I have no doubt that that plays an enormous role. And that once you get into the worshiping of Mammon thing, where you are now making your living on the spiel, any doubts your brain may have are going to be sloughed aside, and you're going to find ways to avoid them. And I'm also a historian of comparable things about ideologues in politics. And a nice case would be how many racists actually were racists and how many were simply doing the racism for the purposes of getting ahead politically. And the one example that pops up as an interesting example here is George Wallace, where apparently he was a bullshitter. He was somebody that really didn't believe what he said. He did it because that's the only way you get elected in the South. And it basically ate him alive morally inside. And he only began to come clean about it in quite a bit late in life. And I think what it looks at when you look at all the different ideologues over history and all their various lifestyles and the like, it's that occurs occasionally, but is relatively rare, that I agree with Maya Angelou that I treat people honestly. If you want to find out what they think, listen to them, and they'll tell you what they think, because most people are eerily honest. I play off of that honesty, by the way, in working out my hashtag tip responses to them, because if most, or if a creationist were a true bullshitter, they could prevaricate at the drop of a hat the way a true psychopath would. So they could easily make up non-existent sources, or claim to have read a source that they hadn't actually read, or studied something that they hadn't actually read. But ironically, the creationist is honest. They will not bear false witness. And if you frame the question correctly, instead of giving an honest, no, I've never read that, I've never studied a damn thing in their life, they don't want to sound that way. A part of their brain is going, oh, that's not going to sound good. So they will just clam up. And they can't answer the question because their brain is seizing up. And I'm going to defend poor Eric, that the man is a Tortugan, and he is incapable of genuine curiosity. He has objects of desire that are absolutely non-negotiable. He's a typical secondary scholar, just like his dad was. He learned it at his dad's feet. Where else would he have learned method but from daddy? Which is, you have the object of desire and information when convenient. So he now has learned how to do the videos, and so now he has a market incentive to do those sorts of things, and that can grease the wheels. In the same way we can see with Charlie Rangel, wonderful, admirable black representative in Congress, but he got used to the perks, and that ultimately was a problem, because you get used to the perks. So you kind of compartmentalize and you don't really bother about it. That's why a lot of what I would call petite corruption leaks into bureaucratic systems. You get used to the thing. You get used to the chauffeur-driven car. You get used to all the kinds of things you do. And fortunately, I have never been tempted with getting used to the chauffeur-driven car, because I don't have any money. But it's an easy thing to imagine happening. And I would think that Eric has succumbed to that just as much. And if you have a Tortugan mind that, remember, doesn't think about things he doesn't want to think about, it can compartmentalize and can easily think that, okay, I have the expediency. You can use it as the cliche of lying for Jesus. There are some aspects of apologetics that borders on that level, of where they would say that a little bit of a prevarication and a little bit of exaggeration is okay because it's serving the better goal. And a lot of spiritualists had that same attitude. A spiritualist who said that they still kind of believed in aspects of it, but they also knew that it was important to bring the believer along. So they would supplement it with a little magic trick here and there. And then they got used to doing that more and more and more, and so forth and so on. And so you get that kind of a mindset. That's why it's fun to study occultism and the history of a lot of the supernaturalist beliefs that are outside of the Christian context, because we can tunnel vision in too much on just the creationists and start looking at how do Hindu believers believe what they do. How do people who believe in magic shrines, or Native Americans with particular magic things that they may believe in? It's the same methodology, the same cognitive architecture. Or let's look at it in a totally secular context. Look at Mark Hauser and how he had as an object of desire that there were certain things about primates that he wanted to be true. And eventually got to the point where he was literally telling grad students that they can't have observed what they just said they observed because it didn't fit his model. And it all blew up in front of him, and he had to leave his position. And now all of his papers potentially have got little question marks next to them, because how much of this was his driving need to have a dogma first. And you could easily argue, well, after all, he was a MIT professor, or whatever the university he was with, and therefore there was, or Harvard, and that therefore there was a monetary incentive for him to believe the bullshit and so forth and so on. But no, it's that Tortugan mind. We find the same thing with, Sir Cyril Burt, with the history of inherited intelligence. And there was a big flap that popped up after he died, where they discovered that several of the papers that he had written out, turns out not only were they made up data, but the co-authors were imaginary. and this turned, that it was just an astonishing bit. The irony was that several of the conclusions that he was offering turned out to be actually correct.
But don't you think that people like that actually know that they're lying? I mean, if you invent co-authors, I mean, at that point you know that you're doing something wrong.
That's why it would be fun. It would be fun to put them under an MRI now to find out what was going on. In fact, Brian was bringing up there actually chemically induced physical brain changes associated with cognitive dissonance and that brain system involved. That it would be intriguing to know, because all of this stuff is back decades ago, long before we could do any studies on this stuff. You can't pick his brain. But I would be predicting that there would be a lot of interesting self-rationalization systems that were coming in there, where he was so sure of himself that when he was deciding, okay, I'm going to make this paper here, and I don't actually have anybody to agree with me on it, but I'll just make up an author, and it's in for the important cause, in the same way that the spiritualist makes up stuff. It's no coincidence, by the way, that Bert also believed in spiritualism, or not spiritualism, but psychic phenomenon stuff. And so there was a lot of crossover in the way people can self-deceive, and you find these relatively rare cases. The things about the Cyril Berts and the Mark Hausers is how rare they are. They're not a dime a dozen. The small level tortucanosity, however, the little bit of a thing where somebody massages the data field, you find that much more common. So somebody like an Alan Fiducia or a Colin Patterson, who just had moments of enormous obtuseness. They were regular scientists, but they were just ones where you're going, have you thought this through properly? I went into Colin Patterson and Fiducia in some depth in the Evolution Slam Dunk thing. Book plug. And so this is one of the hardest things to deal with. And here's the other shoe drop that I think it's also important for people to remember, is that Tortucan mindset doesn't necessarily map on always to things that are false. That people who can believe things that are true can still actually have that Tortucan mind, but we don't notice it because they're saying things that are true. So we're not realizing the extent to which they're relying on secondary sources, the extent to which they don't bother to fact check their sources on it, the extent to which they're not really thinking through what the data feel very much. We're cutting them slack. That actually shows up much more common than we'd like to think. I try to guard against that very point, and I'm not infallible either, but I try to learn from my mistakes. I call attention to my Velikovsky episode in Dynamania. It's in a footnote. I'll be probably putting it up in the write-up in front, because I learned a lot of how I screwed up methodologically from that episode. I also mentioned in the chapter on human evolution, Planet of the Apes, about how I had gummed up on Australopithecine tooth eruption patterns, that I had relied on not one, not two, but three secondary sources. And that was my problem, is that they were all secondary sources. And I got caught on that when the paleoanthropologist who was vetting the chapter pointed out, nope, that's actually behind the curve on that one. And I not only corrected the thing, I mentioned it in the text, because I want people to learn from that mistake and hopefully see it themselves. And then just very recently, just a month or so ago, I had made some comments about Bertrand Russell that were wrong. And I happened to be bumping into a Bertrand Russell expert who really raked me over the coals over it. And I had to go back into my notes and found out, the moment I read over my notes, where I discussed this in the section on "Because the Bible Tells Me So," I realized, all of my information was coming from one source, this monk biography. And at the time I read it, a decade ago, I hadn't realized, you see, he had written a 2-volume book where the first volume was very well received. And so I presumed that this second volume, where all these incendiary things were coming up about his supposedly coddling the Soviet Union and being a homophobe, and a lot of it because he had a gay kid, and that, I was assuming that that was as well researched as his first book was. But I found out, prodded by being raked over the coals by the Russell expert, that, nope, this was in fact, very controversial and well criticized book at the time. And so I immediately went through and did some background research and like, and fortunately it upped my game, because I discovered to my delight that almost all of Bertrand Russell's books are available online now. So I was able to download all of that, so I could read his material directly, and you could see all the stuff in that. So I'll have a much better data set. And when I eventually, if I live long enough to revise that section of that part, I will be calling attention to exactly what mistake I made and exactly how I figured out how to correct it and what the newer information is on that. So all of these methods questions, you find that you don't see that in Tortukans, that they don't get to the error correction phase. They don't look the gift horse in the mouth. They lack curiosity to look stuff up. I quoted, I think at one point, I'm trying to think of his name. It's I can't think of his name right off the bat. But he interviewed a bunch of creationists back in the 1980s and 90s, and he was very friendly with them, and so he got along very well with them. And one of the things was he would try to bring up some information for them to look at, and he was they eventually would be relying on him as an information source, especially in cases where they had lacked the curiosity to look things up on their own. And that was just a classic sign of that parasitical secondary redactor, somebody who can go with a secondary source. And that's the core essence. I'll remind everybody again, the 4 mechanisms of thinking things that aren't true, and people who think things are true might make these mistakes too. 1, over-reliance on secondary sources that they don't fact-check. That's a pathology of behavior in creationism, and you'll find it's the same for flat earthers, for anti-vaxxers, for moon landing hoaxers, for fill in the blank. They're relying, most of them are relying on secondary sources and literally have no curiosity to fact check it. Their brain just shuts down on that point. The scholarship is so obvious on this. Second, they have a core group of fact claimants who rely on an extremely narrow data set. And again, I'm measuring this directly in #tip, which is why people should support the project. Nobody else is doing this work. You've got only about 3,600 primary source technical citations that have been discussed so far from all of anti-evolutionism that I got in my bibliography. Now that sounds like a lot maybe, but not really when you measure it against a data field of 30,000 sources, which is the stuff I've accumulated. 23,000 technicals and 7,000 or 8,000 of the primary, but other ones, anthology books, for example, that are technical works, but they're not technically from a technical journal. And so I put them in a different category. But anyway, it's a ton of stuff. That means they're bumping into only about 10% of the data field. Now, you can't possibly think yourself well informed when you're missing that much data. And if you look at Sanford, not even being able to read the content of his own primary sources correctly, you see it with Dinesh D'Souza, who's in a completely different ballpark, but he literally can't read his own sources. He makes a claim about one book where the page number where supposedly he said it said exactly the opposite. And you're going, whoop. And Dinesh is a collegiate type. He footnotes and so forth. He's preened about what a great scholar and stuff he is. But from a methods direction, he's exactly the same boat as Eric Hovind. He relies on secondary sources to tell him what he wants to be true and has a problem reading and fact-checking. And yet, and you could argue that Dinesh D'Souza has an incentive never to admit he's wrong, and he never admits he's wrong. He's always absolutely perfect, but he's got all the traits of a Tortukan. And so I will never attribute to venality what can be accounted for by mere Tortukanosity, that a mind that doesn't think about that. Now, we got that third problem then, which is the map of time. What do you think happened with the data? The first two were scholarly problems. Those were the inability to read sources correctly, the inability to follow up on primary sources, literally confusing primary and secondary sources, limited data set, all of that scholarly issues. The other two are cognitive. And so number 3 is the map of time issue. I call it in the creation evolution context. It's, what do you think happened? This would apply in anything. If somebody is talking about vaccines, well, what do you think is going on? How do you account for the epidemiological data? How do you deal with the rise and fall of measles and all the rest? And you'd have to deal with that. Tortukans don't do that. They don't think through what they think happened. They go for apologetic points. They go for tropes. They go for the thing that reinforces what they want to be true. And yet they'll never actually work out the details of stuff. And if you ask them methods questions on these things, which I hope to get more and more people doing, you'll be able to puncture them and you'll get that deer in the headlight moment, because this is a 100% failure rate on that number 3. Literally, I don't know of any anti-evolutionist who ever works out a map of time in their head, ever. It doesn't matter whether they're younger creationists or intelligent designers, older creationists, doesn't matter. And you can probe that on matters of any substance whatsoever. And then you get to the number 4, the killer, the deepest one. And that's what evidence would change their mind. And literally nothing can change their mind. Not because they're being craven, not because they're making a ton of money at it, although that helps, but because the brain literally goes, no, 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 that's a forbidden thing. You don't want to think about that. Nope, nope, whoop, you're not going to think about. Good, that's better. Now you're happy. You're not thinking about that because your brain goes into cognitive dissonance modes and you're going to be unhappy and you're going to have to think through your life and you're going to have all sorts of things you're going to have to reevaluate. And I already know in the brain, you're not going to like that. So the brain self-medicates and disconnects. Now, my contention is that if I can ever get a cognitive neuroscientist involved in this, and actually we could test this out to find out whether this is based on reality or not. I think there's this MHBS, this Matthew Harrison Brady syndrome thing, which is the not think about things you don't want to think about component, that probably certainly involves that anterior cingulate cortex. It may involve other brain areas. And there are various things. I've already got 2 working test things that you could look into. One is to test out like somebody like a Hank Hanegraaff on internal contradictions, that their brain would be able to detect internal contradictions unless it carries baggage. So they would be able to see a genealogy problem where there's confusing genealogies if it's just Joe Blow. But you present the same thing to them and they realize one is the Matthew genealogy and the other is Luke from the Bible. And you're going to have something kick in to prevent their brain from thinking about that. And that's going to be this component that's going in. They won't even get to the decision-making area. And then another one that just popped up just recently that's even more interesting was the flask of embryos versus the baby in the burning room thing. This was discussed in relation to abortion issue, and they offered it as example. If somebody who doesn't believe in abortion, serious that all life begins in conception, and therefore a fertilized egg is a bloody person and a baby, and you go into a burning room and there's one child and a flask of 1,000 embryos, which one do you grab? And you can only save one. And he wants them to do this test. And they suddenly realize that's a perfectly good test. Because what I would predict, and this could therefore be testable, is that the kind of anti-abortion person who would have no problem saying up front that the embryos in there are actually people, that when you get to that trolley car problem, which is essentially, this is a variant of it, look up trolley car problem. I'll type it in here so anyone can go, trolley car problem, moral dilemmas. They can check up about this. There's a whole technical literature about this. That we know there are 2 different brain systems that could potentially compete on this. If they have a chance, if they don't think about it much, the amygdala-based emotion one kicks in. If they stop and ponder it, after a while, that slower, more rational frontal cortex one will come in. And they can still, the people who would be willing to push somebody off a cliff are relatively rare. But many of the same people will pull a lever that will do exactly the same thing. And they'll do it emotionally. So it depends on how the trolley car problem is framed. Well, what I suspect in these Tortugan minds is that they never get to that decision stage. That when you would ask them the question about which do you save, you'd get the deer in the headlight moment, and the brain goes into cognitive dissonance mode, and MHBS kicks in, and those brain systems that would normally be used to make moral decisions literally don't turn on. That's what I would expect. And that they would instead answer, I don't know. The I don't know part lights up instead. What was earlier a certainty becomes an I don't know. That would be my working hypothesis. And it'd be fun to see what would happen on this kind of stuff. And hopefully there would be other problems that would be able to measure things in secularists and also in political contexts and a whole bunch of other stuff to be able to see. Once you've identified MHBS, then it could be fun. Because here's the difficulty. If you're just doing tests to analyze how do people believe dumb stuff, and so you ask them a question, do you think the earth is flat? And you find all the people who think earth is flat and you look at their brains, and you look at all the people who don't think the earth is flat and look at their brains and try to find out what's happening differently. And you do this with a lot of different areas. Fine and dandy. But the problem is, if the reason why they can be a flat earther is due to this MHBS component making their minds so they don't think about things they don't want to think about, and that can occur in people who believe things that are true, you're not going to be able to isolate that by asking people about things that are obviously false. You would see it light up on the flat earther, but you may also see that same system light up on the non-flat earther because they have the same cognitive architecture, but it's mapping onto different things. So you'd have to be much more subtle in weeding out these resolution systems than just the content, because Tortucanosity, as I keep on reminding people, is independent of content. It's method and cognitive. It doesn't relate to the content. That's the object of desire. That's the foam on the beer. That's the veneer, the cherry on top. It's the thing they want to be true. It's not the method they use to do it. Logical underlying reason of why I'm a hard ass and ridiculously charitable when it comes to contending that Ray Comfort, who's another flat-out Tortucan, here's a guy who readily accepts secondary sources without batting an eyelash. Does he think through what he thinks happens on stuff? Does he read? Does he realize he needs to read? If you bring stuff up to him, no, he's a very typical lower-level smorgasborder. Behaviorally, he's indistinguishable from Eric Covind. He's indistinguishable from Dinesh D'Souza, even though they have completely different content. Or for that matter, Robert Kennedy Jr., the anti-vaxxer. How he relies on dated source material, that he doesn't really think through what he thinks happened. You can literally pull a card, because one of Cy Stripe's movie nights was on his speech. And we went through all of that. And I was just seeing all the common traits of the Tortucan mind. And here he is, completely different demographic from the creationists. Creationists are typically politically conservative, culture campers, and Robert Kennedy Jr. is a liberal, a totally different perspective, probably a free thinker on a lot of issues. And yet, methodologically, him, Dinesh D'Souza, Philip Johnson, Richard Milton, Ray Comfort, shake them up in a bag, and Noam Chomsky, shake them up in a bag, and they come out the same end in their ability of the brain not to think about things they don't want to think about. So there we are. We have gone way past an hour on that one, but I wanted to give, because this is really an interesting phenomenon that you bring up, and it's a very different perception we have. And as much as would I lose any sleep at night, would I cry in my iced tea in despair to discover that Eric Hovind is a bloody liar and that he knows everything he says is bullshit? No, I would go, shame on you, you pathetic little runt.
No, but here's the thing. If he is a liar, and we can find a way to expose that, that would have an impact.
Well, here's where theoretically the brain scans would be interesting, because if you were to delineate genuine MHBS phenomenon, so that you would be able to tell that when somebody is saying, "Oh, absolutely, the flood happened. I'm absolutely certain of it because I've seen all this science material," and you would be able to detect those little MHBS systems firing off at just the right moments to confirm that. Whereas in a liar, there's no prevarication, there's no MHBS involved. They're lying. They know what they say is false, and different brain systems will light up under those circumstances. So it's potentially testable.
Here's the thing. A liar can be detected in different ways. Did you by any chance ever catch the Bruggencate versus Matt Dillahunty debate, and especially what happened after that?
No, I don't know. Fill us in on that one.
Okay,
yeah, we're going to go way over an hour on this one.
Yeah, well, this is very short. After that, Bruggencate and Eric Hovind came on stage and were interviewed for Dogma Debate. The guy, and I keep forgetting his name, the guy who does Dogma Debate set up the debate as such. And during that interview, Cy came up with a great idea. He wanted Sam Harris and him to undergo a lie detector test, whether or not they believed what they were saying. And damn, I can't remember the name. The guy from Dogma Debate asked Eric Hovind, "Would you be in on this?" And you saw how scared he was when he was asked that
Ooh,
question.
now that is an
He
interesting
answered.
detail. That
He
is an
answered.
interesting detail. I will put that down as a data point. And here it is. Here. If anybody either watching this or
David
following in the live
Smalley.
chat knows people
David
who knows
Smalley. Now,
people who knows people. Sam Harris and others. Sam Harris has done technical work on the decision brain systems and that, so he's connected up with people who do this sort of crap. I'd love to help frame a series of methods-based questions, not merely go after whether they believe it to be true, because they should be able to delineate. We know the brain systems that light up when you say, I believe this to be true, as opposed to I believe it not to be true versus I don't know. We've got that stuff. So that would be relevant to deal with. And this wouldn't be a normal lie detector test. This would be MRIs. It's not the kind of simplistic thing with the stupid lie detector. That's too superficial. No, brain systems, in fact, that they can start identifying the brain systems that will light up when somebody actually is telling a lie, because they don't have the mirror neurons that are lighting up at certain stages. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, if memory serves me, on that one. So it would be really neat. I would then say that anybody who would be unwilling to take such a test is suspicious.
he wasn't unwilling. He said he would take the test, but you saw how scared he was. And if you look in the chat, Brian Stevens says it
Well,
also.
scared in
In
what way? How was
in
he
some,
showing his scared part? Was he like a kind of nervous laughter or what?
I think he was convinced that he would fail.
I'm more
I
charitable on
truly,
body language.
no, I truly think by his reaction, he instantly knew that he was going to fail it. And he couldn't say no because of the audience. So
Well, I don't know about
no
that. I
wasn't,
know
and the
there
pressure
was a street epistemologist.
and the pressure that Cy was sitting next to him. But Brian Stevens says it also. When he's talking to Aaron Ra, he has tells. You can tell
Now, that'd be a fun one to do. It'd be an intriguing thing to analyze, because we now have the brain systems that identify stuff where you have true belief or not. And so theoretically, if somebody is saying something which they believe to be true, that system is going to be kicking in. If they don't really believe it and are just lying, that's going to be kicking in as well. So in principle, this is an empirically verifiable one. And we now put out the challenge, the brain scan challenge. And I would want to do such research in conjunction to try to work out this MHBS thing, because I think this is an extremely relevant thing. And because they've been looking at the wrong direction of confusing this property with mere belief. It doesn't involve the truth or falsity of the belief itself. It even doesn't involve what it is that's being believed in. It's an intermediary layer that I am proposing exists before you get to a lot of that.
I know, and that's where I separate Eric Hovind from the others, because Eric has so many tells when he's being interviewed by the right people. That's why I would love to have a shot at him, because I come from a completely different demographic. I would ask him completely different questions, I think, than someone from the US would ask.
Yeah. The neat fun thing, again, if anybody knows anybody who knows anybody in the cognitive neuroscience field and or Sam Harris, I tried to tweet him, in fact, on this about that embryology example, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and got zip on it because, you know, who pays attention to lowly me? But it would be really fascinating to do that. And it could be reaching the point then when you would now be honestly analyzing. I imagine there are some sincere creationists that would actually be prospect. You, Ross, I bet, would probably be fascinated with the idea of actually doing MRI studies to learn more about the nature of belief and how things work. And it's not something that would be restricted just to the creation, evolution, or religion or non-religion issue.
No, because I
do stuff.
I think I told this on one of Sidestrike's movie nights. I actually befriended a flat earther, and that may sound strange, but he actually believes what he believes. He is convinced that what he believes is correct. And he's not lying. he also doesn't want to see any evidence against his beliefs. So there's that as well. But you can tell from people when you talk to them. You can absolutely tell when you talk to them
Mm.
and they are lying. You can pick that up, and there are ways to learn it. Some people have it. I usually can
Well,
I can I
I'll
can
do
I
one
can
thing.
usually I can usually pick up a liar when
There were a
when
couple.
I'm
There have
face
been a
to
couple
face.
of TV shows that have been done. There was one just a couple seasons ago. It was on for a few seasons about one of these forensic lie detector human beings that's good at reading the tells, and it's a fascinating subdiscipline. And there's an awful
Yeah,
lot that's valuable about it. But I noticed for one of them, for example, is the lying where you touch your ear. That there's kind of a natural reaction, and I found that actually I did that as well. But I noticed the context in which I was doing it. And what it was when I would be repeating something that I had rehearsed a lot, that I had used that pattern before, and so it's something where it's getting into the sync of things. And it is known that liars, when they are lying, often have to rehearse the lie before they give it. And so that may be a tell that's not a tell of the lie itself, but of the rehearsing for the lie. So
could
some of the
be.
things that may be perceived as tells may be a little more complicated. One of the reasons why we could get past the physical observation of just externals and figure out what's going on in the head, because as I said, the fact that we now know the brain systems that are directly involved in belief, disbelief, and not sure.
But
And if we can delineate
if people detect it by little tells, it's not just one single tell. It's a combination of things.
maybe
And
that may be the case, but
you can pick out one you might have, but you wouldn't have the
but
others. So
the the,
you
the,
wouldn't
the
come up.
brain the brain scans would make it empirical, because then we would be able to actually physically observe the kinds of stuff that's going on in the head on that one. And you can't say you wouldn't be curious to know what's going on in Eric Hovins's head, along with
You'll never
anybody else.
get
I'd be
Eric.
happy to go through the thing as well to find out what's going on in my brain in that as well. I think I'm hoping this theoretically could be a really useful component. A lot of the things we bog down in belief versus disbelief, true versus false, may be snagging up on the fact that we don't realize that there's an intermediate level that could be playing a role in both of those brains that is being missed, too much on trying to delineate between the true and the false when we need to look at method up.
The problem would be getting people who know that they're lying and who know that they're a fraud to work with you to get their brain scanned, because I think that's not going to happen.
Well, yeah, it makes it trickier to do, to certainly. And for the same reason that I've repeatedly, every time I bumped into Dan Barton, I've told him, get your damn brain underneath a scanner so we can see what happens when you do glossolalia, speaking in tongues, because he used to do that when he was an evangelical. And
Mhm.
I'm saying that although there's been a little bit of work on some of the brain systems involved, there's not a lot. And particularly, I haven't seen anything. There may be, if somebody knows about it, give me a shout out on the paper on it. But about whether or not the structure that generates grammar in normal language is popping up in this glossolalia or not. So whether or not are they, when they're talking about stuff, actually has the formal structure of normal language, but it's coming out wrong scan, so it comes out as gibberish. Or is it actual gibberish that literally has no connection whatsoever to nouns, verbs, and direct objects and all that kind of stuff? And I don't think anyone's actually looked at it from quite that direction before. And I think it would be interesting to see what's going on in the brain under those circumstances. That would be of
Yeah.
scientific interest. And so the fact
Beach,
that you now would
beach,
have an
beach,
example between a believer and a non-believer both doing glossolalia would be fascinating to see if anything is different between their brains.
Beach just popped that very question. Does it work in the language center of the brain?
Yeah, and I've been fascinated by that question. There's a little bit of technical literature on it I've encountered over the years, And a lot of it's doing with like psychological studies and trying to find out predilections of certain things. But the deeper cognition things about what brain systems are relating to noun, verbs, and direct objects and that grammatical substrate, which is only now being worked out, nobody's looked at it from that direction. And I say, so well, he can still do the bloody thing, and then take a regular believer who still has the faith, and to see what, if anything, is going on differently between the brains of ex-believer versus actual believer, and find commonalities of systems and whether they intersect or not with the neural system. It would be the one as yet and probably unknowable is there grammar in Wales? And what kind of grammar is it? My suspicion is, I've mentioned this a bit, I think, in Planet of the Apes. I think I got some notes and that stuff on it, because one skeptic on cetacean language research was saying, all they found so far is the equivalent of "I am Susie," the little name tag that you would wear at a convention, and it's just very rudimentary. There's no complex grammar to it. And I'm thinking, well, yes, that's true, but is that true? Have no complex grammar, or is it true because their complex grammar can't translate into our context? So the only common elements that we have is the "I am Susie," because of the way their language is built totally differently in the way that it's hierarchical in engulfing different brain systems. Because we know that the cetaceans are on a very different line, primates that led off to human beings. And so there would be a lot of this different cognitive architecture. One thing that's totally weird about your cetaceans that we can't even imagine is that our brain, their brains don't shut down during sleep all the way. Half of the brain shuts down, and while the other half stays active. So there must be a completely different distribution of functions going on, so that they still do their thing. Half of the brain is quiet, and then it flips, and then the other half of the brain sleeps. And this is something totally unlike anything that happens in our brains. The other thing that's really different is the movie in the brain issue, is that we have qualia. You're seeing me, you're seeing color. So things that are traveling at the speed of light waves are being perceived as vision. Acoustic waves that are going through sound waves that are much, much slower are being perceived as sounds. We don't have smell-o-vision. Good for you, not being in the same room to have to worry about whether I smell or not. That's being olfactory chemical inputs into the nose are being perceived as smell. Why are those modalities the way they are? And can you have different modalities? Could you have a cognitive architecture that smells sounds, or that sees a scent, as opposed to the other way around? And then the other issue is what layers of things.
I'm not aware of that. What I am aware of that is that people see music as colors.
Oh, synesthesia. Yes, I have some little notes on that, and I've been keeping track of that as well. Although I didn't have the information back years ago when I wrote the old section, we now have a lot more known about synesthesia. And it's not just, the thing is where people will see colors when they see letters, see colors when they hear sounds. There's various things. Well, it turns out that the brain centers involved in color perception, in acoustic perception, and others are very close together in the brain. And what happens is you're getting wiring forming between those sections that are causing crosstalk. And that's why that occurs. Now, the interesting thing that I pondered is that a air quotes malfunction that is modifying a normal state that doesn't do that? Or is that maybe even a vestigial system that we don't realize used to be there before, but has been differentiated away from as the brain becomes highly specialized? So I wonder whether, if you were to try to find out how many synesthesiacs there were among Australopithecines, how would you know, since nobody writes down anything? There's no letters or music. So that there may be synesthesic systems in the ancient Australopithecine brain that would have been noticeable if you ran them under a MRI and all this kind of stuff. We don't see that over time, because that eventually develops as the brain becomes much more highly specialized, and the old loose connections sever, and you now have much more specialized wiring. So synesthesia may not, in fact, be a odd development on top of a non-synesthesic. It may be the leftovers of systems that kind of got lost in the shuffle because we don't do that anymore. Well, the thing about the cetacean brain, particularly in the echolocators, the ones that use sound waves to get feedback about their environment, particularly in dolphins, that a dolphin can do something that it's difficult to imagine what it senses during that, because we don't have any counterpart to it. And that is that it would be as if you were suddenly walking next to somebody and went hum, and you are seeing inside their body. How does that come up? Does it come up as visual cues? Does it come up as some sensory modality we can't even imagine? We don't know that. So there could be a whole complex structure to whale songs and other things that have a grammatical interconnection that we literally can't decode. And the best you could possibly do is, hi, I'm Susie. The most rudimentary of communication bases, because the cognitive architectures are so completely incompatible. I used the example at one point, I think I mentioned it in the book. It was an old episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, where Captain Picard is beamed down on this planet, and he encounters an alien, and he's getting gibberish from his universal translator. It's all talking about, strange character names from novels and a bunch of stuff. And he thinks something is completely malfunctioning with the translator, and it turns out he finally realizes that alien's language system is so completely different from everything the universal translator has been used to that it can only translate the surface laters. And he discovers eventually that their language is communicating by metaphor and analogy, always, so that they would mention Gilgamesh as something relating to what Gilgamesh refers to. And so he could finally figure out this strange storytelling grammar of this, and he could start communicating with the guy. And that, I thought, was a useful analog to the possibility of whether or not cetacean language is something that's so completely alien to us that we can't work out, maybe never, what's actually going on in there. And even another analog would be birds. We now know that birds see a much broader spectrum of color range than we do, and they can see into the ultraviolet. We can't. Although some human beings occasionally have mutations that give them a little bit more ultraviolet visualization than we normally do, but nothing at all like birds. And it turns out a bunch of feathers on a lot of bird species just scream in ultraviolet. So what looks like the most boring patch of feather you could imagine, when you look at it through an ultraviolet filter, there's this big blob of ultraviolet reflection. A lot of insects see in that range too. And in fact, there's even a species, flower identification is done by a lot of bugs, where they're looking at the ultraviolet reflections off of the flower. And there's a species of spider whose webs are highly reflective in the ultraviolet and act as a bug attractor for food. But what's going on inside their brains? We can see the color range that we can see, reds and blues and violets and all the rest. We can see iridescences and all this stuff. But what does it mean to have a mind that can see a broader range way farther out in the spectrum? And how does that connect up to their sensory, the picture in the brain, which I suspect all complex organisms will have effectively a movie in the brain? And how alien can it be? We don't know the answers to a lot of these things. And if they're qualia problem, we're probably never going to be able to figure them out. Well, there's a digression for you, and we've gone way beyond an hour, but so we'll still remain. Is Eric Hovind a bloody liar, or merely a poor pathetic Tortugan, and that we need a telethon? As yet, there is no cure, or it could be a combination of both. And I'm open-minded on the matter, but I never underestimate the ability of a Tortugan mind, even brilliant ones, especially brilliant ones, to self-deceive.
Here's the thing. You know what we should do? We should get Eric Hovind and come on both our channels. You're going to lecture him on evolution, and I'm going to grill him on whether or not he is real or not. Wouldn't that be a good plan?
I would be delighted with all that. Well, in fact, yes. In fact, I would probably bring up the issue that there are some people out there who are convinced that you're a bloody liar. And it would be fascinating to try to figure out. So I would be probing him from a methods direction. And I would wager that if I was asking him about those methods questions, about how does he source check stuff, you'll get exactly the same reaction you got from Mark Huffman, that he just goes into that deer in the headlight mode.
He looks at newspaper articles.
Oh, he doesn't even get that, he doesn't even get that far. I would not be surprised that he looks after David Capege's site, Creation Headlines, I think it is. In fact, Sanford, or no, Snelling, it's one of the S's, Creationists, recently did a posting on that. I discovered. I think it was Sarfati. That I was going, wow, that's a Creation Headlines. Ooh, he's branching out. He's subletting. David Capege, for those of you who don't know who David Capege is, he was an annoying jerk who worked at Jet Propulsion Lab. He did some astronomical kind of stuff, and Jet Propulsion Lab finally let him go because he wasn't terribly productive, and he put a lawsuit up that this was because he was challenging Darwinism and all of that. And the Discovery Institute was constantly preening about him as being a poor, persecuted but he's an annoying jerk and a young Earth creationist. And all you have to do is look at his bloody website. You can see all of that. He's just I discuss him a little bit because he bumps in at one point to a fossil in the reptile-mammal transition, and I dismantle how his mind is avoiding the content of the data. He's playing apologetic Parsi games, which is very common for the thrust that involves in that. But yeah, it'd be fun to ask him in just a conversational way where he gets his source material from. We know the stuff he puts up on his videos.
You know, I have a theory. Not a scientific theory, just a theory. So for people who
a hypothesis
are word perfect. What I'm thinking is that the sources Eric Hovind uses to as he thinks debunks evolution is he goes to newspaper articles. What do you get with newspaper articles? You get a clickbait title to an article, and usually the title has nothing to do with the content of the article. It's just to draw people into reading the article. But Eric doesn't read the article. He just reads the part to where he comes to the first contradiction with the title. And then he has his gotcha moment, because now you have this title.
In terms of secondary sourcing, an awful lot of people in the anti-evolution movement get their stuff from reading secondary sources. And yes, so Denise O'Leary is notorious in my frame for that. She's an intelligent design person.
But this is the easiest way to debunk. If you have a title that's just there for clickbait, and in the article itself, it contradicts the title. That's what he uses. That's what he uses.
There's a long. I don't even think he gets actually that far, but there are certainly anti-evolutionists who do that technique. They riff off of the title, particularly related to new fossils, where they'll say, "Oh, some amazing new fossil completely rewrites our history of human evolution," or something, and that's the title that's way overinflated. And you might find Jerry Coyne or somebody that would come in and write a snarky little article explaining why the nature or some new scientist has overblown the thing because of the bloody headline. That happens a lot.
You don't have to look that far. That happens twice a week on Answers News.
And I knew, they're largely drawing on secondary source material. I know Elizabeth Mitchell, who does her the News to Know thing, almost entirely is relying on secondary news accounts, stuff that she's read in National Geographic or in Science Daily, or any of these other Phys.org, and Denise O'Leary does exactly the same thing. Again, I'm counting all of this to see that some are worst offenders in this area. Even though the primary source paper may be directly accessible, it literally doesn't occur to them to look. And they don't often even read the content of the secondary source very accurately. I've spotted that an awful lot in there. Whatever I would imagine given the nature of what I've seen Eric do so far, is that he would make Denise O'Leary look like a careful scholar. That I don't think he's anywhere near that level of gumption. He's a visual sort of guy, but that's the way his father was. His father wasn't a writer. He was a street preacher. And he would do things as lectures. Now, the one thing that Eric shows that he is uncomfortable with.
Wait. He wasn't a writer. He wrote 32 books while he was in jail.
Oh, well, they're all crap. I mean, in the same sense that the chimpanzee stuff together. Yeah, that Hovind is very, very light and superficial on stuff. The vast majority of the impact of Kent Hovind is from his videos, not his books. And although you do occasionally bump into, once in a while, I'll bump into a creationist who actually claims to have read a Hovind book, but I bump into a lot of Hovindistas who have seen his videos. So that's his primary form of evangelism. And this has been way for a very, very long time. I mean, he's been busy beaver at this since the 1990s. And in fact, I first bumped into him. I described the episode in Dynamania. I first bumped into him way back in the 90s because my brother had bumped into a young earth creationist who was viewing Hovind videos. And so he got a copy of it to me and asked me to vet it, look at it. And that's where I encountered Hovind because I hadn't heard of him before. And I actually wrote off to Hovind when he was still there in Pensacola. And he answered me back. And he actually telephoned me after a bit, his dime, fortunately. And so I've actually communicated directly over the telephone with Mr. Kent Hovind many, many years ago. And he also, he took umbrage at any implication that he was dissembling or lying on anything. No, that anything he might have said was inaccurate. He was very, very persnickety about that stuff. And fortunately, from my methods approach, you really do need to see content data and source data. And so Hovind would seem to be really awkward because all his stuff are lectures where they don't have references. So he's just spewing material and once in a while mentioning something that's related kind of, sort of, to a name or so. And it's hard to vet him. But at the very least, there was one wonderful case where a very diligent Hovindista went through a whole slew of Hovind's videos and did transcripts. So it was possible now to actually go through and read the way you need to be able to analyze the full content rather than just viewing it as a live wire video. And I don't view a lot of videos. I admire people who can have the stamina to go through an hour-long thing that's got 1 minute of relevant information in it because it's just a lot of time wasting.
The person you just mentioned, you said that they did transcripts of his videos. Did they also copy down what he had on his slides during the talk?
In some cases, yeah. And nothing about it surprised me. When you actually look at him from a source methods direction, you can see he's very parasitical. I don't think Kent Hovind he doesn't qualify as a fact claimant. Nothing he ever says is original to him. He has borrowed stuff from other people, often websites and other secondary sources. That's why it'd be fun to track down the kinds of stuff. I mean, at least Eric has kind of a superficial scholarliness. He invites on real live people and actually attributes to him because he's got them talking right in front of you. So in effect, they're functioning as a walking footnote. The daddy is entirely his show. And he preens and gives the impression that he's kind of the one responsible. When he talks about, we have discovered something, you know, no, not him or even anybody he's particularly read on the subject. So he is very much a grandstander. And that puts him, as I pointed out, Donald Trump is the Kent Hovind of American politics, or Kent Hovind is the Donald Trump of creationism, whichever one you want to look at.
And he at least recently adopted someone to help him with his efforts because, well, I just mentioned the books. Do you know the best joke of the book he wrote in prison, because he changed his position on the tribulation and on the rapture, and he wrote a book. What on earth is going to happen, for heaven's sake, is the title, I think. When he got out of prison, he had just a few of those books printed with a hardcover, and he sold those for $100 a piece.
Oh
And
my!
and
Well,
and
well,
you know
well.
and you
How
know
did
and
we
you know
look
what
forward to
happened
explain that?
when he sold all of them? He had he
What?
had uh, a second edition printed, which was actually corrected by his then new assistant, who took out all the grammar errors. So
Mhm.
the people who, and that book sold for $50, and I think it's even less now. So the people who paid the most have the
Got the
one
worst.
with the worst language in it.
Oh yeah, yeah. No one can ever accuse Kent Hovind of being clever and articulate with written text. And anybody who's ever had a chance to read through his doctoral dissertation, that should be in air quotes, especially the earlier version, because he keeps on revising the bloody thing. But the earlier ones, it was just riddled with just ridiculous stuff and
I've
preposterous
actually
sources and all of that. It's hilariously bad. But that's why source methods analysis is so useful if you have written argument, because now you can't just have the bullshit in the breeze. You got to actually document stuff, and then you can see in an argument where you have claim, 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 no data, no data, no data, no sources, no sources, no sources. That stands out in a written context. It's not quite so obvious in the bullshit thing. I mean, here, technically speaking, have I offered any sources for my material, footnoting a reference? No. Although, theoretically, anybody could ask me about any of the kind of stuff, and they could look up the topics that I discussed. Even you'll find occasionally perfectly fine science books that are written for a general audience that aren't referenced in that context. But if you want to get serious on stuff, you got to actually offer the data, and it needs to be stuff that can be empirically verified. And Kent is in a little class all by himself that even young Earth creationists regard him as a doofus, that they regard him as theologically inept from young Earth creationist doctrinal point of view, and they also regard him as factually a problematic because he just swallows stuff hook, line, and sinker that even they shy away from. So he has no standards whatsoever. And you got to admit, you've got a small band of the full-blown PhD sciencey types at AIG and ICR and all the rest that want to have the pretensions of science involved, and they feel they're doing their careful work in the rate group and all this. They're trying to be sciencey. Methodologically, they're still Kent Hovind, and they've just got more footnotes in there, and that also becomes obvious the moment you start looking at the data field. Those 4 points, all those are going to be popping up in one way or another. So Eric, some of the reaction that Eric might be having in offering the defense in lieu of the fact that we don't have him under a brain scan, is that when his brain encounters the oddball circumstance where he might be getting out of his depth, that's when a lot of defense mechanisms will be kicking in and reaction things will be going on, and who knows what's going on inside the little brain on him. But yeah, if we can ever do, Ray Comfort's another one that I would be gobsmacked if that guy didn't believe everything he said. That he's got all of the glib, superficial modalities of a standard run-of-the-mill creationist. He's a pure secondary source addict. He relied on other.
And now I'm going to put it to you. Ray Comfort gained worldwide attention with his banana piece.
Yeah.
And recently he told Lawrence Krauss that it was just a comedy skit. It wasn't to be taken.
Well, if he's done that, yeah.
It wasn't to be taken serious. He said it wasn't to be taken serious. I have seen him give a talk when he was still in New Zealand, where he was 100% serious in what he said.
Well, to be fair, and of course, Lawrence Krauss can have blind spots on his own. So whether or not he was reporting the conversation accurately is an interesting thing.
No. The conversation was taped. You can watch it on YouTube.
But the thing is that look, Richard Dawkins, nobody would accuse him of being a Ray Comfort type, but his changing attitude about whether or not the selfish gene was merely a metaphor or not. It didn't sound like it was a metaphor at the time, and he stuck with it not really being a metaphor for a very long time, including a lot of his tussles with Stephen Jay Gould. So that can occur even higher up on the food chain than Ray Comfort is. But it all depends, too. Krauss is from a completely different universe than Comfort is. Comfort is from an apologetics point of view. There's, for example, in religious apologetics in general, Christian apologetics, nicking quotes from people is considered perfectly appropriate. And so the idea that you would need to give attribution when you steal text literally doesn't occur to them as a problem. Martin Luther King would do that. And so it was completely across the board in there. So the idea that what he means by comedy sketch in the sense of humorous effect, and whether or not he actually thinks that bananas were designed or not, and still thinks they are designed, is a different kettle of fish. And it'd be fun to pin that one down with some methods questions in that as well, because a lot of people can use terms vaguely on things. And as I said, it's independent of whether or not he's a prevaricator or not. They're all Tortukans. That's an indisputable. So they all have minds that are capable of doing that kind of dissembling and self-deception and data missing. And in that case, you know, it's worse for their case if they're doing this kind of stuff along with craven purpose. That's even worse. And you get into this too in areas of source attribution, where most of the time, most people simply copy other people's mistakes. So they repeat the trope. But there are instances in which you have now only two scholarly alternatives. When Philip Johnson, in some cases, nicks out one little key sentence from a quote that alters the meaning of it deliberately, you got to think he knew what he was doing when he did that. It's not something that's too tactical. I discussed that with the thing I think I was relating to Stephen Weinberg. It's one of the chapters in the old book. And just like with Dinesh D'Souza, when he literally cannot seem to read the content of the text, either he knew that he was misrepresenting the source, in which case he's a craven little liar, or he literally couldn't tell what the text read because he doesn't know how to read very well. And his brain is just clogging up in the course of that. Neither one of those are nice alternatives from a scholarly methods point of view, but one of them must be true because the texts don't match up. So those are interesting litmus test things. There are relatively interesting minor examples about non-existent sources. Steve Austin did a co-author with a little minor character named Hush, it's one of the Acts and Facts things, and it's on mollusks, and supposedly there's this mollusk problem, and he cites a particular technical paper that was published in an anthology. At least that's what the footnote said. And when I went around, because now I hunt up all the primary sources whenever possible, I discovered that that title didn't show up at all anywhere. And the title of the book it was supposedly in didn't show up anywhere. And fortunately, I was able to contact the author of the supposed article, and he had no clue what the hell he was talking about. So there were only now two scholarly alternatives. One is that either Hush or Austin, or together rubbing their brain together, made up a completely imaginary source bullshit. Or one or the other of them had read something or heard something from somebody secondarily where a paper was being discussed, but maybe they wrote it down wrong, and maybe they wrote this down wrong, and that it got muddled in a telephone chain error. And then when they put it in the footnote, didn't take the trouble to fact check it. I'm a charitable one, and I think that's the more likely alternative. But, you know, I don't rule out the possibility that they actually were bullshitting. Well, we've gone way over an hour, Peter. So, and so anyway, for those of you sticking around, I will actually be calling. Oh, and I forgot to do my shameless plug.
Wait, James. You want me to
run out of time? Yeah.
You want me to shame you a little bit more? We even went over 2 hours.
Yeah, I know. I was being gentle about it. Let me put up my shameless plug here, because I need to point attention, because there are people who actually have been over that. And there we go there. There's my tips patrons. Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totis Rial and Paul. And I want to thank you all for helping. Normally I stick this in the middle of the show, but now I'm putting it up at the end because we got too long on all these little distractions. There's my website, tortuganwordpress.com. If you don't have that on your speed dial and your tabs and all the other things, what's keeping ya? The Patreon, I've got to say that it's really slow for money to actually come through Patreon. So may I please recommend, if you want to help the project, please go to the GoFundMe.com thing, because that actually hits me way faster. And as a terribly impoverished person that's wearing a coat at the moment because I'm rationing my fuel here, I could certainly use the help to keep going and someday afford to buy more ink. So there's the stop sharing thing. And then we will be shutting down. Thank you, Peter, for joining me today and running way over the time.
For derailing. I derailed your entire. Yeah. You'll have to.
Yeah. Well, I hope we touched on an awful lot of interesting areas, and I will reiterate. It is really an interesting disagreement between us that is potentially resolvable as to how many of anti-evolutionists or people who say all sorts of woo stuff are saying so cravenly, dishonestly, lying and doing it only for the money, versus ones who are hyper-Tortugans who are saying bullshit and claptrap because their brains are so malfunctioned that they can do that with a completely straight face and really believe it. And I would love to know the answer to that. I'm sure you will want to have that resolved. So Eric and Ray Comfort and all the other ones, let's get going with that brain scan so we can find out whether or not you actually believe what you say you do. Okay.
That would be awesome. That would be awesome.
It would be indeed. Well, thank you very much. We are stopping our show at 2 hours and 16 minutes. And thank you for our evolution hour. Okay.